Seeing me holding my newborn in worn-out clothes, my grandfather frowned. Wasn't $250,000 a month enough? I never received a single dollar, I said. He picked up his phone and called his lawyers immediately. My grandfather has never cried in front of me. Not at my grandmother's funeral, not when he had his first heart surgery at 71, not even at my wedding, though I'd caught him blinking hard during the vows in that careful way of men from his generation who've decided grief is a private transaction. But when he walked into my hospital room 3 days after I gave birth and looked at me, really looked at me, at the same shirt I'd been wearing since Tuesday, at the dark circles carved under my eyes, at the way I flinched when the nurse mentioned the bill. His chin did something I'd never seen it do before. It trembled, just once. Then he locked it back down. "Claire," he said quietly, pulling a chair close and sitting in it like his legs had suddenly remembered his age. "Wasn't $250,000 a month enough?" I thought I'd misheard him. "What?" "The money." His voice was careful, measured. "I've been sending it since your wedding, every first of the month without fail. I wanted you to be comfortable, to never have to work." He looked at my hands, chapped from the night shift cleaning job I picked up at 6 months pregnant because we couldn't cover the electric bill. I assumed you were choosing to live simply. My daughter was asleep on my chest. 8 pounds, 4 ounces, 2 days old, and already the most real thing in the world to me. "Grandpa," my voice came out wrong, too small. "I have never seen a single dollar." The color left his face. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone, pressed one contact, and when the line connected, said 4 words. "Get me Patricia. Now." That was when the door opened. "My name is Claire Ashworth. I'm 29 years old, and until 72 hours ago, I would have told you I had a pretty good grip on the shape of my own life. I grew up with my grandfather, Edward Ashworth, my mother's father, after my parents died in a car accident when I was 9. He raised me in his house in Savannah, a graceful old thing with wraparound porches and too many rooms and a kitchen that always smelled like the housekeeper's biscuits. Grandpa was old money Georgia, the kind who wore the same watch for 40 years and never mentioned what it was worth. He ran a private equity firm out of an office downtown and had the kind of reputation that made people straighten up when they said his name. He never made me feel like a burden, not once, in 20 years. He also, it turned out, had been quietly sending $250,000 every month to an account I'd never seen the inside of. I met Mark Calloway at a fundraiser 3 years ago. He was finance, charming, the kind of handsome that looks better in person than in photos. He laughed at the right moments and remembered small things I'd mentioned weeks earlier, which I now understand is a skill, not a quality. We dated for 8 months. He proposed at the restaurant where we'd had our first dinner. Grandpa liked him. That mattered to me, maybe too much. Grandpa was a precise judge of character, except it turned out when the character was specifically performing for him. The warning signs were there. I just had a very thorough system for explaining them away. The joint account Mark suggested we open, and then steered all my income into, seemed efficient at the time. The way he handled all our finances because he was better with numbers seemed like a reasonable division of labor. The way our grocery budget kept shrinking while his wardrobe kept expanding. The way I found myself doing math on a restaurant menu, and he never seemed to. The way he started describing my grandfather's money as something we'd have access to eventually. I told myself each of these things was nothing. A quirk, a temporary imbalance, the ordinary friction of merging 2 lives. Then I got pregnant, and things got tight fast, and Mark got busy, and the small imbalances started to stack. I picked up a second job at 6 months pregnant, 2 overnight shifts a week cleaning office buildings because our checking account was hovering and I couldn't stand the feeling of floating. I didn't tell Grandpa. I was ashamed. I thought it was our problem to solve. Mark knew about the cleaning job. He called it industrious. He brought me a smoothie once while I was getting ready for a shift, kissed my forehead, said he was proud of me. $8 million was sitting in an account with his name on it. I didn't know that yet. The first thing I noticed was the Amazon packages. This was around month 4 of my pregnancy. Mark's mother, Vivian, had been spending more time at the house. She lived 40 minutes away and had the kind of schedule that seemed to contain nothing that couldn't be rearranged to accommodate dropping by. She and Mark had always been close in the way that made me feel like I'd wandered into someone else's movie. She had opinions about everything in our house, including how I organized the kitchen, which she expressed as helpful observations delivered in a tone that made it clear disagreement was a form of ingratitude. The packages were arriving daily, addressed to Mark mostly, though some had Vivian's name. Clothes, mostly, high-end, brands I recognized but couldn't afford to shop at. I mentioned it once, gently, I thought, and Mark said he'd been doing well with a portfolio and had treated himself a little. He said it with the kind of easy confidence that closed the conversation. I went back to my shift that Friday and mopped 12 floors and told myself I believed him. The second thing I noticed was the vacation. Mark and Vivian went to Napa for a long weekend in my 7th month. I didn't go because I was exhausted and swollen and genuinely preferred the couch. Mark sent photos, a rental car, a vineyard, a restaurant with candles and white tablecloths, and the kind of wine list that doesn't include prices. I liked the photos. I told him it looked beautiful. I had declined the hospital's premium birthing suite the week before because we couldn't cover the upgrade fee. I looked at the vineyard photo and thought, he must have a portfolio I don't know about. He must be doing better than I realize. I should ask him about it. I never asked. The third thing, the thing that cracked the floor under me, happened the day I came home from the hospital. We'd been there 3 days. Me, Mark, and our daughter Nora, who had arrived pink and furious and immediately necessary. The hospital parking was $28 a day. I know because I'd checked. I know because I was doing that kind of math constantly, that grinding low-grade financial anxiety that had become so familiar, I'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound that's always there. Grandpa had come to meet Nora on day 2. He'd held her for 20 minutes without speaking, which was the most tender thing I'd ever seen him do. Then he'd looked at me, at my shirt, at my eyes, and asked his question, and my entire life rearranged itself. The door opened and Mark walked in first, followed by Vivian. They were laughing about something. Vivian had 4 shopping bags looped over one arm: Nordstrom, Neiman Marcus, a small boutique I didn't recognize with tissue paper visible at the top. Mark had 2 more. They were mid-sentence about something, still smiling, already carrying the casual ease of people who had excellent days all the time. They saw Grandpa's face, and the laughing stopped, not gradually, instantly. "Edward," Vivian said. Her voice went careful, controlled. "What a nice surprise." Grandpa didn't look at her. He was looking at Mark. Mark, just his name. Quiet, the way a door closes before a storm. Mark set the bags down. His smile was performing a death it hadn't been informed of yet. "Hey, Edward, I didn't know you were stopping by. Where has my granddaughter's money gone?" The room had the specific silence of held breath. Nora had been fussing softly for the last few minutes. She stopped too, as if even she understood that something enormous was happening. Mark blinked. "What money?" "Don't." Grandpa's voice dropped to something I'd never heard from him before. Not anger. Anger is loud. This was colder. "Every payment went into a joint account designated for Claire's household expenses. An account your name appeared on as co-manager. An account she never had independent access to." I looked at Mark. He wouldn't look at me. "Things were complicated," he said. "Financially. The market." 3 years, I heard myself say. My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from another room. 3 years of wire transfers, $250,000 a month. I did the math out loud because I needed to hear it. That's $8 million. The number sat in the room like a physical object. "You told me we were tight," I said. "I picked up a cleaning job at 6 months pregnant, Mark. I cried over a grocery bill. I apologized to my grandfather for not being able to visit more because I couldn't afford the gas." My hands were shaking. I didn't try to stop them. "And you were sitting on $8 million. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his face wasn't guilt. Not exactly. It was something worse. It was the look of someone recalculating. "You don't understand what it takes to maintain our position." "Whose position?" My voice cracked on the word. Vivian stepped forward. Her chin was lifted in the way she did when she was assembling her authority. "Mark's career requires a certain presentation. His network, his client entertainment, his career," Grandpa said, cutting her off with the precision of someone who has been cutting people off in boardrooms for 50 years, "is about to be the least of his problems." Mark dropped the performance. "Just let it fall." "Fine." His voice went flat and cold in a way I'd never heard before, like something underneath the charm had finally surfaced. "Fine. Yes, I used it, because I earned it. You have no idea what I do, what I manage, what it takes to—" "Stop talking," Grandpa said. Mark stopped, just like that, like the command had short-circuited something. "Pack a bag," Grandpa said to me. He didn't raise his voice once. "You and Nora are coming home with me tonight. My attorneys will handle the rest." Vivian grabbed his arm. Her composure was fracturing. I could see it in her eyes, in the tendons of her neck. "Edward, please. You'll destroy him. He has a reputation, a career, people who depend on him. If you do this—" He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. "He robbed his pregnant wife," he said. "He can keep whatever reputation survives that." She let go. We were in Grandpa's house in Savannah by 11 p.m. My old bedroom was exactly as I'd left it when I got married. Same quilt, same lamp, same view of the oak tree I'd climbed approximately 9,000 times as a kid. I sat on the edge of the bed with Nora on my chest and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding an enormous thing without knowing it for a very long time. The next morning, Grandpa introduced me to Patricia Mercer. Patricia was 57, silver-haired, and had been Grandpa's lead attorney for 15 years. She wore charcoal suits and spoke with the focused economy of someone who billed by the hour and considered small talk a form of waste. She had a law degree from Yale and, Grandpa told me later, had never lost a civil fraud case. She sat across from me at Grandpa's dining room table with a folder thick enough to use as a weapon. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start at the beginning. Don't editorialize." I talked for 40 minutes. She took notes without looking up, asked 3 clarifying questions, and when I finished, said, "Good, now let me tell you what we already have." She opened the folder. 3 years of wire transfer records. Every payment, dated and time-stamped, flowing from Grandpa's account into the joint household account, and then, within 72 hours of each deposit, routed in partial amounts to a second account, a private account, Mark's name only, at a bank in Delaware. "We found it 6 days ago," Patricia said, "when your grandfather noticed some irregularities in the payment confirmations and called me." She turned a page. "There's also a third account, offshore, Cayman Islands. Approximately $1.2 million moved there over 18 months. The number landed like a second punch after the first had already knocked you down." She kept going. Credit card statements showing Vivian Calloway as an authorized user on one of Mark's private cards. $12,000 in a single month. Luxury hotels, restaurants, a jeweler in Atlanta. A receipt for a weekend trip to the Bahamas. Mark and Vivian. While I was in my second trimester telling my OB I needed to delay a test because of the copay. Then she reached the last item. "This one," she said, "is the piece that makes everything else unnecessary." She slid a printed transcript across the table. A conversation conversation with timestamps pulled from the cloud backup of Vivian's Amazon Echo. The smart speaker in her kitchen had logged it automatically. Mark's voice, then Vivian's, then Mark's again. She'll never find out. Old Edward trusts me completely. And if he does find out, Claire will take my side. She always does. I read it twice. My vision went strange at the edges. Are you all right? Patricia asked. Keep going, I said. She told me the plan. Fraud, financial abuse under Georgia domestic statute, civil theft. They would file in the morning. And at the same moment the papers were served, 9 a.m. sharp, her office would send a press release to 3 financial news wires. I looked up from the folder. Why the press release? Because Mark closed a 7-figure investor deal last Tuesday. A venture capital group out of Atlanta. $3.4 million committed, with a second tranche pending. She folded her hands on the table. Those investors have a right to know the character of the man they've put their money behind. My heart was hammering. Will it hold up? The transcript alone would hold up. The financial records are ironclad. The offshore account is going to involve a separate federal conversation, which is not our filing. That call has already been made to the appropriate agency. She closed the folder. By noon tomorrow, every phone in Mark Calloway's life will be ringing, and for the first time in 3 years, he won't have an answer for any of them. That night, I sat in my grandfather's kitchen at 1:30 a.m. with Nora in the bassinet beside me, and a cup of tea I'd stopped tasting, and thought about the version of myself who had mopped floors at 6 months pregnant and felt grateful for the extra shift. I thought about how shame works, how it moves into you quietly and makes you feel like the problem is yours to solve. The financial anxiety, the grocery math, the borrowed maternity clothes I'd told myself were fine, were temporary, were just part of building a life. I had been so careful not to ask Grandpa for help, so careful not to seem like I couldn't handle things, so proud of what I thought was my own self-sufficiency. It wasn't self-sufficiency. It was being looted so skillfully I didn't know I was bleeding. Mark called 7 times that night. I watched his name appear and disappear on my screen and felt nothing but a bone-deep tiredness. He was still calling the next morning when Patricia sent me a single text at 9:02 a.m. Served. I put the phone down and looked at Nora's fingers wrapped around mine. At 9:47, Vivian called. I could hear her screaming before I even brought the phone to my ear, so I held it away and watched Nora's eyelashes instead. Voicemail. At 10:15, Patricia texted again. Lead investor called. Pulling out both tranches, $3.4 million gone before lunch. At 10:52, a financial journalist named David Park, byline at the Atlanta Business Chronicle, 15 years covering Southeast markets, called my grandfather directly. He'd received the press release. He had questions. Grandpa referred him to Patricia, who was, I later learned, already on a second call with the Associated Press. At 11:58, Mark's name lit up my screen. I stared at it for the full length of the ring. Then I set it face down on the table, and I made more tea. The weeks that followed had the strange quality of aftermath. Everything raw and still, like a landscape after weather. I was healing from childbirth and a marriage simultaneously, which is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't have a name I know of. Mark's attempts to reach me cycled through stages with a predictability that would have been almost clinical if it hadn't been my life. First, calls and texts, dozens of them, ranging from apologetic to explanatory to, eventually, entitled. You need to hear my side. You're being manipulated by your grandfather. You're going to regret this. I read them the way you read a weather report for somewhere you're not going. Informative, not personal. His lawyer sent letters. Patricia sent them back, each time with slightly more documentation attached, which I understood was her way of communicating that we had more material than they'd anticipated, and she was enjoying making that clear incrementally. Then Mark made the mistake that changed the temperature of everything. He attended his company's quarterly charity dinner, one of those black tie affairs where the actual charity component is roughly 15% of the evening and the networking is 85%. His investors, his partners, his professional network, all in one room. He'd apparently decided that offense was better than defense, because he stood up in front of 200 people and said that his wife had suffered a postpartum breakdown and abandoned him, that she'd taken his daughter from him without cause, and that she'd turned his grandfather-in-law against him out of spite. 200 people. Among them, 4 of my grandfather's business partners, 3 longtime friends of his from their club, and the wife of his lead attorney from a separate firm. By 7:30 the next morning, I had 12 voicemails from people I'd met over the years at Grandpa's dinners and gatherings, people I'd always perceived as politely distant because I was younger, because I was just the granddaughter, who were now calling to say they'd heard what Mark had said and wanted me to know that they were available to speak on my behalf, to testify if needed, to help in whatever way was useful. The 12th voicemail was from a woman named Constance Beaumont, who was 81 years old and had known my grandfather for 40 years, and apparently had a very specific opinion about men who lied about their wives in public. Tell Patricia to call me, she said. I have a long memory and a large address book, and I've been waiting for an excuse to use both. I played that one for Patricia, who smiled in a way I hadn't seen before. Constance Beaumont, she said. Good. You know her? She's been on the board of 3 major charitable foundations for 30 years. She has relationships with every journalist and donor in a 200-mile radius. Patricia opened a new document on her laptop. Mark just made a serious error in venue selection. The defamation angle was added to our filing that afternoon. Patricia contacted David Park at the Business Chronicle, who had already been building his piece and was now, I was told, expanding it from a single article to a 3-part series. The hearing for the emergency protective order was 17 days after Nora was born. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled, efficient, the kind of room that processes human damage at industrial scale without losing its procedural calm. Presiding was Judge Diane Okafor, who had been on the Chatham County bench for 11 years and had, according to Patricia, a particular and well-documented impatience for financial abuse cases where the documentation was clear and the defendant had chosen audacity over contrition. Mark arrived with his attorney, a man named Gerald Hastings, who wore a very good suit and the expression of someone who had looked at the evidence and was already thinking about his next case. Patricia presented Exhibit A through Exhibit M wire transfers, account records, the Delaware account, the Cayman account, the credit card statements, the Echo transcript. Gerald Hastings objected twice. Judge Okafor sustained neither. When it was Mark's turn, Gerald made an argument about the complexity of financial management in high-net-worth situations and the nature of marital accounts and the question of consent. It was technically coherent. It also had no answer for Exhibit G, which was the transcript, and Exhibit L, which was the offshore account documentation that a federal investigator named Agent Thomas Riley from the IRS Financial Crimes Unit had, by that point, independently flagged and was pursuing on a separate but parallel track. Judge Okafor granted the emergency order. She also made a comment from the bench, which Patricia told me later was unusual. Judges typically keep their observations procedural about the calculated and sustained nature of the financial control evidenced in the record. Mark didn't look at me when we filed out. I hadn't expected him to, but I noticed it anyway. The Business Chronicle piece ran on a Thursday. David Park's byline above the fold digitally entitled "The Other Account: How a Savannah Finance Manager Redirected $8 in Family Funds Over 3 years." It was careful, sourced, specific. It named the Delaware account. It named the Cayman account. It quoted 3 investors who had either exited or frozen their relationship with Mark's firm. It included a statement from Patricia on my behalf and a statement from Gerald Hastings that was 4 sentences long and said essentially nothing. By Friday morning, it had been picked up by the Associated Press. By Friday afternoon, it was on 3 financial news aggregators and 2 general interest outlets. Mark's firm had 9 employees. By the following Monday, 6 of them had resigned. His mother, Vivian, called me twice more in that period. The first call I let go to voicemail. The message was long and alternated between rage and pleading in a way that told me she understood, at some molecular level, that her authorized user card and the Echo transcript had done significant damage to her own position. The second call came the day after the AP pickup, and I did answer it. Not because I had anything to say to her, but because I wanted to hear whether she'd apologize or double down. She doubled down, told me I was destroying a good man, told me Mark had only ever tried to provide for our family, told me I owed her a conversation. "You were on his card, Vivian," I said, "the one funded by the money that was supposed to pay my electric bill." She hung up. 3 months after the hearing, I was sitting on Grandpa's porch on a Saturday morning with Nora in my lap and coffee going cold on the railing beside me when he came out and sat in the chair next to mine. We watched the street for a while. The old neighborhood sounds, birds, a sprinkler somewhere, a kid on a bicycle. "I want to tell you something," he said. I looked at him. "I should have structured it differently from the beginning. A direct account only in your name. I trusted him because you loved him, and I used your judgment as a substitute for my own. That was my failure." "Grandpa, let me finish." He was looking at the street. "I told myself the money was a gift to your marriage, not to you specifically. That it would be managed jointly because that's how marriages work. I told myself a lot of things that were mostly excuses not to look too closely." He paused. "I'm sorry, Claire, for the cleaning job, for the grocery bills, for every moment you felt alone in that and thought it was yours to fix." My throat tightened. "I didn't know," I said. "I know you didn't. That's what made it work." He finally looked at me. He counted on both of us not looking. We sat with that for a while. "Patricia says the civil recovery is strong," I said eventually. "It is. Between the domestic accounts and the offshore recovery. They've frozen the Cayman account. The federal piece is moving. You'll have access to most of it eventually. Maybe 18 months. He picked up his coffee. "The rest will come from the defamation settlement. Gerald Hastings called Patricia last week. Mark wants to settle before discovery." She said no. She did. Grandpa almost smiled. "She said discovery would be more useful than a settlement at this stage." Gerald apparently agreed pretty quickly. The AP article had mentioned the charity dinner speech. Mark's remaining professional relationships had mostly evaporated in the 2 weeks following publication. The venture capital group had not only pulled their investment, but filed their own civil complaint, which added a second front to the legal exposure. Agent Riley's federal investigation was proceeding separately, with a timeline Patricia described as slow but inevitable. Mark's firm had formally dissolved. He was, as of last week's legal correspondence, living in a short-term rental in Marietta and had requested a modification to the protective order to allow supervised visitation with Nora. Patricia had responded with a counter-proposal that included conditions she described to me as achievable if he's serious and clarifying if he isn't. I didn't hate him. That surprised me more than anything. I'd expected the revelation to leave some hot, clarifying fury I could burn through and come out the other side. But what I actually felt was something more like the absence of weight, like setting down a bag I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there. I thought about the woman who had mopped floors in her 3rd trimester and felt proud of her efficiency, who had apologized to her grandfather for not visiting, who had done math in in her head at restaurants and called it being careful. She wasn't naive. She was deceived by someone who had studied her trust and treated it as a resource. There's a difference. It took me a while to hold on to it. 6 months after Patricia slid that transcript across the table, I signed a lease on a small house 3 blocks from Grandpa's in Savannah. 3 bedrooms, a yard, a kitchen with a window over the sink that gets the morning light. I went back to work part-time. I have a background in nonprofit development, which I'd put on hold when Mark suggested I focus on the house. I'm rebuilding that now, slowly, on my own timeline. Nora is 6 months old. She has her great-grandfather's eyes, which are gray and deliberate, and she has already figured out that if she looks at him long enough, he will eventually make a fool of himself trying to make her laugh. I don't think about Mark every day anymore. Some weeks I barely think about him at all, which itself feels like something recovered. Patricia emails me updates when there are updates. The federal investigation is ongoing. The civil recovery is on track. The defamation case is moving toward trial because Mark, true to form, apparently believes he can still win something. Gerald Hastings sends letters that Patricia describes as increasingly fatigued. The last thing I heard directly from Mark was a voicemail 4 months ago, in which he said he wanted me to understand that he'd made mistakes, but that he'd always loved me, and that he hoped I could find it in my heart, eventually, to forgive him for the sake of their daughter's stability. It was very well constructed. I could hear how much work had gone into it. I saved it, not for myself, for Nora, so that when she's old enough to ask questions about her father, she can hear what he sounded like when he was performing remorse and decide for herself how much weight to give it. That's the thing about men like Mark. They always believe the next version of themselves will be the one that finally convinces you. He said on that recording Vivian's smart speaker made that I always took his side. He was right for 3 years. But the thing about always is that it only takes once to make it a lie. And I had a grandfather with a phone and a lawyer who ate lawsuits for breakfast. That was enough.